Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today we're screening A Ghost in the Making, searching for the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee, presented by Clay Bolt, Communications Lead for WWF's Northern Great Plains program, natural history photographer, and is a producer and writer and also featured in today's film. So thanks for being with us today, Clay. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all of you for joining today to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, and those are bees. Especially for those of you who are in the Northern Hemisphere right now, we're starting to see bees flying about in our gardens and parks and the wild places that we enjoy hiking in. And it's a good reminder, I think this film is a good reminder that all of us can do something to help give back to conservation. Certainly, as we'll go through when I talk about the film a little bit, and as you watch the film, you'll notice that I'm not a trained biologist. I'm someone who developed a passion for bees and began to use that passion to help protect them. So a little bit about myself. I'm a natural history and conservation photographer, which means that I document the life cycles of species, and then I use those images to help protect the species through working with different conservation organizations like World Wildlife Fund, National Geographic, National Wildlife Federation, and other organizations that are committed to protecting the wildlife that we share this world with. And, you know, I get to travel to a lot of really cool places for my work. I work in places like Panama, photographing a diversity of insects. I'm always focused on the small things, generally speaking, that many people tend to overlook because they're so vitally important to our world. Things like damselflies that we may see flitting past a creek or a pond, and we're not really sure what it is. I use my photography to help bring those species into a degree of more awareness for the public. I love photographing reptiles and amphibians. I think that they are another group of species that are in certain need of protection and more appreciation. And here in the World Wildlife Fund, and based out of Bozeman, Montana, I get to work with great biologists like Christy Bly, working to help protect species like the endangered black-footed ferret. And I really enjoy the process of going into the field with scientists and biologists who are able to tell their own story, and I help use my images to help tell the story. And that's something you'll see in the film that we're going to look at today. Recently, we celebrated World Bee Day, and I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but during that, I was able to share some facts that I'm going to share with you today about some of the bees that we have in our world, because I think that all too often we have this idea that bees are basically honeybees, and we have sort of these other ideas about what bees are. We do know that there are bumblebees, but we often don't realize just how diverse bees are. So I'm hoping that for those of you who aren't aware, some of this information will be both surprising and sort of mind-blowing for you as well. Because for me, the diversity of bees is just something that I find endlessly fascinating. So there are 20,000 known species of bee in the world. And I say known because we're always discovering new species, whether that's through actually finding a bee that's very different looking, or as often is the case these days, through the study of genetics, where there are many bees that look similar. But once you look at the genetics, you realize, wow, there's many more that look similar. And they come in all different forms. There are very fuzzy bees. Bees do lots of things like flying in the late summer. You can see this bee covered in pollen. And that's one of the things that separates bees from wasps, is that bees are covered in something called scopal hairs. And if you looked at them under the microscope, the hairs on a bee are more like a feather. They're branching, and those branches catch pollen, either through direct contact or even through static electricity, which pulls the pollen to the bee's body. Whereas wasps in general are very smooth and often have very few hairs. And so that's one of the differences. Whereas wasps are carnivorous, typically preying on things like spiders or caterpillars, bees primarily, in most cases, only eat pollen or nectar. And they do lots of cool things. I mean, we have squash bees here in North America that only feed upon squash blossoms, and they wake up early in the morning before honeybees ever begin to fly. Some of them are really small. These are both bees that are smaller than a grain of rice on a very small aster. Most bees are actually what are called solitary species, and so they sleep not in a nest at night, but together. So this is a photo of a type of bee that I photographed in Indonesia, and these are all the males. So no male bees sting, actually, only the females sting, and most bees can't actually sting you. The stingers are too small. Honeybees are the only ones that die after stinging you, and they have those mechanisms where the venom continues to pump, but most bees don't do that. And so because most bees are solitary and they don't have a nest to go to, and because male bees can't sting, they don't really have very much of a defense mechanism. So they'll sleep together at night like this, in defense on pieces of vegetation. So if you go out in a meadow at night, you might find bees sleeping in these cool clusters. And they come in all different shapes and sizes. This is a tropical orchid bee. This is a male, actually. So if you look at the end of his tail, you might think, wow, that's a stinger. But actually, remember, male bees don't sting. So actually what this is his tongue folded beneath his body, because he's specially evolved to feed on the nectar of certain types of plants with long plant tubes, similar to a hummingbird. There's another example in South Dakota of male bees sleeping together. There are blue bees in the world. This is a species from Indonesia as well that has scales like a butterfly. So if you were to touch this species of cuckoo bee, the color actually rubs off. So there are all sorts of different adaptations that bees use to move through the world. There's some really strange bees. This is a species from Chile that visits a certain type of plant that has these very, very long, it's in the Atacama Desert, and it has these very long corollas or pollen tubes to keep the nectar very secure from drying out in the hot desert air. This is another species from South Africa that has developed these really long legs in a similar situation to get to these floral oils down in flowers. We even have here in the Americas bees that fly at night, believe it or not. This is a species that I photographed in Panama. And if you look very closely at her head, you can see these droplets that almost look like little pearls. Those are special types of eyes that capture low levels of light. Here in North America, we have 4,000 known species of native bee, being the US and Canada, just to be clear on that. And if you include Mexico, nearly 7,000 species. And they do lots of different types of things and come in lots of different colors, from very small, beautiful sweat bees to striped resin bees. We have very fuzzy late summer bees that pollinate things like sunflowers. We have longhorn bees. We have very, very tiny bees. This is a type of what's called a kleptoparasitic bee that's actually smaller than a dime. So super tiny, but just really beautiful. We even have fuzzy-legged leafcutter bees. This is one of the grumpiest little bees I photographed. I photographed this one in Madison, Wisconsin. And those fuzzy hairs on the front leg are actually not just for decoration. So the males are very territorial and aggressive, and when they're mating, they don't want the females to see any competing males. So they actually cover up her eyes with those front legs so that she can't see any other males passing by. And one bee that I learned about in 2003 is a bee called the world's largest bee, Megachile Pluto, also known as Wallace's giant bee. And I learned about it in a story, or this book called The Malay Archipelago, written by Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-creator of the theory of evolution, or the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution. And in 1898, he discovered a large black wasp-like insect with immense jaws like a stag beetle, which was described as a bee in 1859 by a famous biologist back in London. And I decided that I wanted to help protect this bee for a number of reasons, which I won't go into today. And so in 2019, after many years of planning, I went to Indonesia and was able to become the first person to photograph a living Wallace's giant bee. This is a photo that some of you may have seen. It ended up being a huge story around the world. And this is where it's found. It's found in a very small chain of islands. This, again, the world's largest bee. So it's about the size of a man's thumb. And believe it or not, quite gentle. Most bees are not very aggressive. The really social bees are the ones that are aggressive, like honeybees, because they have a huge larder of honey to protect. But most bees are, fine. They're solitary, and this one is a solitary bee as well. So even though it's quite large, you can see how much larger it is than a honeybee. It was very gentle. But I was able to use those three discoveries to help protect this species from being collected. And it was a big story, like I said. I mean, and if anything, this reconfirmed my idea that people are really, really interested in bees, because in the media, the story had over 2,000 hits, and this is a fairly old statistic now. It's probably much further than that now, but a reach of 2.4 billion. It was in every major news outlet. It was mentioned even on Saturday Night Live. I mean, it was a crazy, crazy situation. It appeared in comics, and someone even got it tattooed on their feet. So people were crazy for this giant bee. But the bee that I care about the most, I guess I would say, and the group that I care about the most are bumblebees, in part because they're incredibly important pollinators. And we have 42 here in the U.S. In Montana, where I live, we have the highest number of bumblebees of any state in the country. And unfortunately, they're just not doing very well. 1 out of 4 species of bumblebee in North America is at risk of extinction. But they're great because they're found in our cities, they're found in our nation's capital, they're found in high mountain meadows. Bumblebees are strong flyers that can fly in places where other bees can't fly. In the Rockies, where there are incredible storms, bumblebees are still able to fly, like this fuzzy-horned bumblebee. They're found in coastal areas, places like the Pacific Northwest. They're found in our prairies. They're found in agricultural areas. This is in South Dakota. This is a brown-belted bumblebee visiting a milkweed patch amongst a crop. They're found in community gardens. But like I say, 1 out of 4 of these species, even though they're so ubiquitous, are not doing really well. And when I first started studying bees, I had no idea that this was the plight. As you'll see in the film, I kind of came across an understanding of the situation that these are in somewhat serendipitously, but it led me on this incredible journey in my career. One species, this is Franklin's bumblebee, which was seen for the first time, or last seen, I should say, just in the early 2000s. Today, this is the only place I can photograph Bombus Franklin's bumblebee as it's known, because it's most likely extinct. And it's a close relative of the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee. And we've now learned some of the causes of this decline, and I won't give that away, but I'll talk about it in the film. But it's a serious issue that continues to this day. But when I began working on this film, on the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee, no species of North American bee had a protection under the Endangered Species Act. And even today, it's quite low. But we knew, my colleagues and I knew, that if we didn't elevate the status of this bee, that we wouldn't have a fighting chance to help protect it. And so that's what we're going to go into in the film today. And we'll go over that. You could also see the film after this. It'll be shared on the NatHab website, but also you can go to rustypatched.com if you want to learn more about the species afterwards. But after we release the film, things you don't see in the film that we're about to see is that, I premiered it all over the country in places like National Geographic's headquarters in DC. I was part of a congressional briefing on Capitol Hill to help talk about the importance of protecting the Rusty-Patched and other species of native bumblebee. We had releases everywhere. We created a petition with change.org, raised nearly 130,000 signatures using this film as a advocacy tool. And this is what we don't see in the film, is how we were able to protect it. And there's a lot more to this, but it was an amazing day. And it just goes to show how you can use media, including photography and film, to help people realize what we stand to lose if we don't speak up for its protection. So now I'm going to pass this over, and I think we're going to watch the film.
Great, yeah. I am about to bring up the video player. And if you're on a mobile device, you may need to swipe left or right to view the video. And you also may need to adjust your volume as well.
I started this journey chasing one ghost and ended up taking a lesson from another. We humans defend the things we value, but how can we care about something we barely know? That's the question I needed to answer. That's why I traveled halfway across the country looking for a bee. can't remember what first attracted me to insects. I was always shy, and I wasn't very good at sports or other socially acceptable things. I was the kid who was good at science and art. And even though I've got kids of my own now, not much has changed.
I've been training all my life for this. That's why I'm still dressed like a 10-year-old boy.
My name is Clay Bolt. I'm a nature photographer, and my favorite subjects in the world are the little animals that most people ignore. Like everyone else, I had heard about the sudden die-off of honeybees. So one day, I went looking for bees near my home in South Carolina. I found some gorgeous little bees that didn't look much like honeybees, but I had no idea what they were. I did some reading and discovered that there are almost 4,000 species of wild, native bees in North America. Honeybees, the ones everyone is so worried about, actually don't belong here. Europeans brought them over with cows and chickens and all of our other domesticated animals. We know almost nothing about most of the native species, and so photographing native bees became my obsession. I wanted to figure out which bee species I'd photographed, so I went to visit the research collections at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Becky Nichols, the park entomologist, wanted to make sure I also saw the bumblebees, one species in particular.
The Rusty-Patched Bumblebee has not been seen in the park since 2003, despite repeated efforts to find it. We do have records of it occurring all the way back to the 1930s, and so we're not entirely sure why we're seeing the decline, especially in a protected area like the national park.
Looking at this desiccated bumblebee impaled on a pin, it was hard to believe that something so amazing could just vanish. There was a stuffed passenger pigeon next to me, sort of staring off into space with its glass eyes. That was the most numerous bird on the continent, but we exterminated it before we even realized what we were doing. I wondered whether the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee, like the passenger pigeon, was another ghost in the making. It had disappeared from most of the East in a little more than a decade, yet most people had no idea it was ever here. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I saw a post on a bee listserv that gave me hope and sent me up to Virginia to meet Ty Ralston.
So last year we had traps set up at 17 different fields throughout this region, and the overall program is designed to understand what influences bee populations. And then one day I just saw one with a little bit of a bright rusty patch on it, and I just kind of looked and said, I want to take a look at that one. Called up Sam Droege and said, Sam, I think I've got it. And I sent him a picture, and he said, it certainly looks like Bombus affinis. And he said, that'll be big news.
I got it, indeed was that species, and we took a whole series of pictures of it because it was a big deal to find that bumblebee. So, we're just hoping for more.
What this one specimen means is really a big question. It's possible that this is one of the last little populations of a species that's going away, and it's possible that there are areas out there where the species is doing okay. We have gone back to the same site on 2 occasions with a crew of 8 to 10 people, and we have not been able to find it again, unfortunately.
At the U.S. Geological Survey in Maryland, Sam Droege was capturing these amazing, detailed images of specimens in museums to help other researchers identify bees. But you don't have to be an entomologist to think these pictures are just awesome.
The pictures are very similar to the shots that you see from the Hubble telescope. We knew beforehand what a star looked like. It was a tiny little dot at night, and we all had that same experience. Everyone knows what a bee is, and they have a mind picture of something that looks kind of like a honeybee, maybe a little more colorful, and then you show them these pictures, and there are green bees, and there are blue bees, and there's, iridescence and stripes, and large ones and tiny ones. One of my daughters Facebooked me and said, Papa, I think someone has stolen your pictures. And and she gave me a link to Reddit, and they had stolen it, but we allow people to steal the pictures, right? So they linked it back to the Whoa Dude subreddit, which is the stoner subreddit. Why was my daughter looking at the stoner subreddit? I don't know. In 2 days, like 200,000 views.
As a photographer, I might have been a little jealous of the attention that Sam's images got, but I also realized that I was adding something new by photographing living bees in their environment. I had a few thousand species to choose from, but the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee was at the top of my list. I needed to find out what had happened to these bees and where I could still find them. And Sidney Cameron at the University of Illinois had some evidence of what might be going on.
Not all species of bumblebees are declining in the United States. The Rusty-Patched Bumblebee has undergone probably the most serious decline. And we know that because we went back to the historical collections that museums maintain, which are incredibly valuable for doing work like this. You compare the historical with the current, we're able to get the relative distributions and abundances of bees over the last 100 years. When bees, commercial bumblebees, are put into greenhouses, potentially with whatever parasites or diseases they might have, they come and go through the vents. It was hypothesized that a pathogen was introduced from Europe via American bees being contaminated in European facilities, a pathogen known as Nosema bombi. The conclusions that we drew from the screening of Nosema was that indeed there was a very significant correlation between the declining species and the high prevalence of Nosema bombi.
With every single thing you do, the universe is split in two. With every single choice you make.
I went to see some greenhouse bumblebees, and it was so obvious that they were different. They were technically Bombus impatiens, which is a common wild species, but these commercial bees had no fight left in them. Who knows, maybe they were carrying Nosema. Either way, if these bees made contact with the bumblebees outside, it's hard to imagine there wouldn't be consequences for the wild ones.
The commercial industry is doing a service by growing bumblebees, an important service. However, if I say, look, you cannot ship or should not ship outside the native region of a species, well, why not? Well, because it could be carrying parasites. Well, then you have to prove that. And that's a big effort. That may take my entire career to prove. In the meanwhile, these guys are still shipping bees all around the world.
On the one hand, you have a multi-million-dollar industry, and on the other, an insect that most people don't even notice. If Nosema is causing the bees' decline, then their best hope is to develop resistance to the disease, and they can only do that if they have time. There are still some Rusty-Patched Bumblebee populations in the upper Midwest, and whether I could photograph them or not, I needed to know they were still out there. A bee biologist named Rich Hatfield suggested that we meet up in Madison, Wisconsin to try and find the bee.
This is a species that used to be one of the most common bumblebees in the eastern United States, and now its relative abundance has dropped by 90 to 95%. So a once common animal has become incredibly rare. In February of 2013, the Xerces Society filed a petition with the Fish and Wildlife Service to have the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee listed as an endangered species. And under the law, the Fish and Wildlife Service has to reply within 90 days with what's called a 90-day finding. They just have to respond and say, this species warrants a further investigation by the Fish and Wildlife Service, or it doesn't.
When I met up with Rich, more than 900 days after the petition was filed, there still hadn't been a 90-day finding on the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee. If the agency responsible for endangered species couldn't be bothered to respond, then the bee was going to need some other allies. If I could photograph the bee, Then at least people could see what we stood to lose. Thanks to Susan Carpenter, I found my first Rusty-Patched Bumblebee at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, a living, flying bee moving around a healthy landscape. Rich had his first live sighting too, after advocating for this species for years. I'm almost haunted by the thought that these insects have no idea that they're some of the last of their kind. They're just doing what they do, making a living like they've done for thousands of years.
See, the thing is, most people don't realize that male bumblebees don't sting, so it's like you've got superpowers. Nerd power.
There are at least 7 other common bumblebee species living in the Arboretum, and I wondered if I would recognize a rusty-patched if I saw one. But soon, I didn't even need to see the rusty mark to know when I was looking at the right bee. The way it moves, the way it feeds, they're just a little different. Different enough that the ecosystem would know if the rusty-patched bumblebee were missing. I photographed the rusty-patched feeding and flying and resting for the night. One of the really special moments, even though it's not the best photo I got, was finding a gine, one of next year's queens, like a fuzzy little symbol of hope for the future. I couldn't leave Wisconsin without visiting Aldo Leopold's shack. As I got to know the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee, I kept thinking about his words. Leopold wrote, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen." Before coming to Wisconsin, I was a layman. I didn't know the bee, and I couldn't possibly understand the gap it would leave if it disappeared. But now, I'm troubled by the prospect of a world without it, even if I can't quite articulate why.
What good are insects to start with? You can answer that question in a couple of different ways. One is you can try to figure out what good are they doing for me? What is the value of that biodiversity? I think we can all agree that having 0 species probably is not a good situation to have. Having lots of species, well, is that better than just having a few? There was a very interesting and provocative paper that came out just recently that in fact looked at the contribution of bee diversity to pollination returns. And what they found was that it's actually not bee diversity per se that is important, but it's just a core group of species, common bee species, that do most of the crop pollination. So if we take that economic argument again, what is the value of all those other species that don't seem to be getting you an economic return? In theory, they're worth 0, and we shouldn't be conserving them.
The Rusty-Patched Bumblebee might well have been one of those economically valuable bees. And if its populations recover, maybe it will be again. But I don't think dollars and cents are the only reason to care about a species.
On the one hand, I completely understand that it's difficult to value something that it seems so detached from our everyday lives. On the other hand, if you don't need to put that value on it, that also says something about how you value other life in general. And I'll never forget the first time I put a beetle under the microscope and looked at it up close. And I thought, these are the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. That was good enough for me. I didn't need to put any value on it. They were just beautiful.
If you ask kids to name a bee, they will say honeybees. If you ask them to draw a bee, almost every single time they draw a bumblebee. Sometimes they think they're drawing a honeybee, but they draw it black and yellow and kind of fat. You know, they draw bumblebees. I live in the middle of Winchester, Virginia, the biggest town in, 40-mile radius. And I've got 4 species of bumblebees in my backyard. So we are all in it together, supporting those populations.
Bumblebees and other pollinators really need 3 things. They need flowers, they need a safe place to build their nest, and they need a pesticide-free environment. And as long as you can provide those things, it's truly a build it and they will come scenario. If you build habitat, pollinators will show up.
We spend so much time and effort making life better for ourselves. The least that we can do is make life possible for this bee. What will it take to save this species? It won't be effortless, but we're talking about the existence of a species. People everywhere share a desire to feel wonder. We gravitate toward rare, beautiful things. And we've got one right here. The Rusty-Patched Bumblebee really is an amazing little animal. When you get to know them, all species are. That's what gives me hope. Leopold said, "Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language." Do we have it in us to save the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee? I think we do.
Step forward, oh no, no,
Okay, Clay, I'm going to give you control again. And we're going to jump right into the Q&A session. So first question for you, Clay, is one of the most popular questions. What kind of lens are you using when you're photographing these bees?
Well, I use a variety of different lenses. And so I guess my go-to would be for some of the smaller bees, I'm often using a very short macro lens, somewhere around the 55 millimeter to a 100 millimeter. Some of the shots where the bees are kind of backlit and I want to show them sort of more of a diffused background, I'll use a 180 millimeter macro lens. And then for some of the images where I'm showing the bees, like the one on the screen where I'm showing them up close in the context of their background, I often use a lens called a Sigma 15 millimeter diagonal fisheye. That's a mouthful. But that lens allows me to get very close to a subject. I'm probably just a couple of inches away from this bee, but yet show the background. And so that's a combination of those different tools that I use.
Great. Another question for you. What's the difference between a honeybee and a bumblebee?
Well, that's a great question. So honeybees, first of all, they're both separate species. Honeybees are the most social of all bees in the world. There are also a few other bees that are social in terms, and by social, I mean they have a structure consisting of a queen and then workers who their only function is to either gather pollen and nectar or care for the young, and then males that come out later in the season, sort of all in one sort of social structure. So honeybees are very social. There are also bumblebees, which are very social, and then stingless bees, which are found in places like Central and South America that also have that social structure. Bumblebees are a bit different in terms of they start out with a single queen who mates in the fall and then overwinters and then comes out in the spring, and she begins to do all of the roles. This is how bumblebees in one way are different than honeybees. Whereas with honeybees, there's a queen and her only job is to lay eggs. She never does any of the work With bumblebees, the queen emerges in the spring. She begins to gather nectar and pollen, lays eggs, tends to those eggs until they hatch, and then she goes to more of what we would call the egg laying or queen role. So they're a little bit different in terms of their social structure, but in addition, bumblebees are super pollinators in terms of they can do cool things like detach their wings from their flight muscles, which allows them to regulate their body temperatures. They also can do something called buzz pollination or sonication, which is, you might hear a bumblebee buzzing on a tomato flower, for example. They are able to vibrate their wing muscles in such a way at a middle C note that causes pollen to fall down from those flowers, and honeybees can't do that. So there are a lot of just differences, but they're both relatives. They just have sort of a different life cycle and different foraging strategies.
Okay, interesting. Another question is about the difference between males and females. You mentioned that only females can sting, so how can you tell the difference?
Well, with bumblebees, for example, and with honeybees, there are certain things you can look for, and it is tricky. You have to spend a lot of time observing. I mean, there are certain things that you could count, like under a microscope, like the lengths of the antennae or the lengths of the abdomen. With bumblebees in particular, there's a few species that are very visual and they sit on flowers. They have bigger eyes in general and longer antennae. Also, if you look at the back legs on a bumblebee, female versus a male, females, similar to with honeybees, have something called a corbicula or a pollen basket, and these are hairs that sort of go around. You might have seen bumblebees or honeybees with these big balls of pollen on their back legs. Males don't have that because they don't collect pollen; they only drink nectar. So just a lot of different visual cues like that takes a little bit of time to get used to, but can be seen in the field.
Great. And how can we identify a rusty patch when we're looking for one?
Well, one thing you can think about is geography. So if you're in the upper Midwest, right now the last stronghold for the species, unfortunately, is in places like Madison, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois. You know, sort of that region is the hot spot for the bees, and throughout that region. And then there's a small patch in Virginia, near the George Washington National Forest, where we're finding a few more. But in general, on the second segment of their abdomen, there's the first two segments of the abdomen are yellowish, and then just beneath that second, there's sort of a light rusty half moon shape. There are a lot of other bees that have much brighter orange patches, and oftentimes people are contacting me saying, I found a rusty patch in Seattle. Well, they don't exist there. There are other orangish bees there. So looking at your geography would be a big start. And then there is a great app that you can download if you go to Project Bumblebee or bumblebeewatch.com. You can look up Bumblebee Watch online, and you can find that there's this app, and you can take a photo with your phone and send it in, and the experts will verify if that's a rusty patch or not. That's the best thing you can do.
Great. And we do have a lot of requests for your opinion on some books that people can pick up.
Sure. So if you just want to learn about bees in general, like in North America, The Bees in Your Backyard is a great book. You can find it on any sort of online outlet. And that is a great book in terms of not necessarily learning all of the individual species, because we have like 4,000, but at least getting you down to family level is a great place to start. The other book that I would recommend is Bumblebees of North America, which was put out by Princeton, and that has all of the species in North America. And it's a little bit more scientific, but it's the only guide that currently exists for the bumblebees of North America. And then the other things I would recommend, a great tool is iNaturalist. So if you can photograph any bees you see of any kind, post the photo on iNaturalist, and there are a lot of experts who will go in and help you identify what you found. And the other cool thing about that is you're contributing to citizen science. And so it allows you to help track bumblebees in your part of the world. Many places have not been surveyed very well, so I'd really recommend checking out iNaturalist. It's completely free. You can do it online or on your smartphone.
Fantastic. And what kind of plants can we plant in our gardens to help the bees thrive?
That's an awesome question. It's a really important one too. So the good thing about bees is that as long as they are given a pesticide-free environment, like Rich says in the film, a place to nest, and food, which in the case of bees comes in the source of flowers, they will show up in your yard. You will have bees. But like us, bees need food throughout the year. So from early spring until fall comes, bees need food. And one of the mistakes I think people get into when they're first trying to plant from bees is they go to like a big box store and only buy plants that bloom in midsummer. But again, like us, bees need food all season long. So what I would really recommend is you could go to your local extension service or a native plant nursery and pick out a selection of native plants. Natives are, I mean, they don't have to be native plants, but it's pretty easy to get native plants that are native to your region that begin blooming in early spring, and then things like goldenrods that bloom in the fall and late summer, so that those bees have a full diet, a varied diet, and you'll have a lot of diversity of bees as well as the more you plant different types of native wildflowers. And the cool thing is that native plants, once established, usually you have to baby them a little bit the first year, but once they're established, they don't require tons of maintenance or upkeep. They just do their own thing, so that's great.
Great. There are a few people who want to know about the lifespan of the Rusty-Patched Bumblebee, and do they have similar lifespans to other bumblebees?
So yes, they do have life cycles and lifespans that are similar to other bumblebees. Of course, some bees, for example, that live in warmer places or, warmer climates may have a longer season, whereas there are places out here in Montana where the season is only like a little over a month, really high in the mountains. So spring and summer is very compressed, but the cycle is the same. And basically how it works is in the fall, the new queens emerge from a nest and they mate with the males, and then the males die and the females go and overwinter in like a rodent burrow, like an abandoned mouse nest. And she'll stay in there in a state of sort of hibernation until spring when it warms up. And she's already mated, so she goes out and she finds nest sites, and you'll see bumblebees flying around the ground, these big, beautiful, large new queens flying around, searching for a place to nest. Once she finds that, she begins to build little wax pots that she can put nectar in, and she lays her eggs and she sits near the eggs or in cold places on the eggs like a mother bird, drinking from this little nectar pot and leaving very rarely from the nest. Then the young are born, the new worker females, and they start to do the work of pollination, and that goes on through the summer until the males emerge, and the process repeats itself. So that process is pretty much the same for most bumblebees. There are some weird examples in the tropics where nesting is different and that kind of thing, but most nests are underground, and then some do nest on ground. It just depends on the species.
Okay. And we have kind of a big question here. If bees become extinct, how will that affect humanity?
That is a big question. I would say, a lot of times people will say, well, we will starve to death if there are no bees. That's not necessarily true, because many plants like corn are wind pollinated, so we don't necessarily have to have bees for that. But the number one thing is that in terms of our food, our selections would be drastically reduced if bees were to go extinct. Severely, there'd be a lot less options on the shelf. But in terms of nature as a whole, because so many plants are pollinated by bees, so many things that have seeds that birds eat, and of course all of the other things in nature that depend on flowers and flowering plants, it would cause a tremendous cascade in the natural world. Bees are so incredibly important, and even though a lot of other things are pollinators, bees are the most important pollinators in the world because of they're just specially adapted to pollinate flowers. So what we would see in general is a world that pales in comparison to the world that we live in now. And unfortunately, because of the pesticides that are being used, the pesticides that are being put on the food crops we grow, loss of habitat, disease, all those things, a lot of bees are in serious trouble, unfortunately.
Okay. And there are a lot of people who are curious about where the bumblebees nest, how do they nest, and what do they do over winter?
So as I was mentioning, basically what they do is the queens mate in the fall, and so she will go into a rodent burrow or a hole in the ground somewhere and go into a state of torpor. it's not really true hibernation. It's something called estivation, but it's basically suspended animation where she's alive under the ground, but she's not moving around doing anything until the weather warms up. Because like all insects, bees are ectothermic, which means that they get their warmth from the sun. Even though they are able to vibrate those flight muscles, they can't do it until it gets above a certain temperature. But then when spring comes, they go out, you'll see them flying around. That's how, as soon as spring comes and there's a warm day, you'll start to see bumblebees flying around. Those are the new queens. They don't have a nest or a colony of workers yet. They're just out looking for a new nest and food sources.
Great. And there are a few people who want you to comment on the murder hornet phenomenon and the threat that possesses for the bees in the area.
So the murder hornet, or as I prefer to call it, the Japanese giant hornet, is a species that has been in the U.S. actually for a few years now. Its distribution is very limited. They are not more deadly or dangerous than honeybees. In fact, honeybees, the beloved honeybee, which is, as I mentioned, not native to the U.S., causes many, many more deaths for people around the world than anything else, because as far as stinging insects go, because they are so highly social, because of the way that they can continue stinging after they die and those kinds of things. So I would say that if you're not afraid of honeybees, then you don't need to be afraid of murder hornets or Japanese giant hornets. The other thing is that, they're not going to be in every part of the world. Like the European giant hornet's been in the eastern United States for a long time. They're actually quite docile, maybe compared to the giant hornet. But we have a lot of things in the world that are more deadly. And this is just a bit of a media hype to some degree. I wouldn't lose too much sleep over the giant hornets.
Okay. Just a couple more questions for you. What is the effect of climate change on our bee populations, both domestic and global?
This is a really good question, and the answer is a bit complicated and also a bit we're not sure yet. But in particular, bumblebees are being affected by climate change because they actually evolved in the Himalayas, high in the Himalayas, in places where it's quite cool. And so you have a lot of species, a lot of the diversity is found. If you imagine if you're familiar with the concept of island biogeography, or think of a mountain as an island in the sky, right? There are species that can only exist at a certain elevation. And as temperatures rise, those species have to go up higher and higher in the mountain to survive. And so eventually those that are on the top are pushed to extinction because they don't have anywhere else to go. And so climate change is affecting a lot of species that do rely on those cooler climates. In addition, what's happening is you're having the bloom times of certain flowers getting out of sync with the emergence of certain species of bees. And so a bee may emerge and it may have a special relationship with a certain kind of flower, but that flower is no longer blooming. It's already bloomed or it hasn't bloomed, those kinds of things. So unfortunately, it is causing a lot of issues, but we're just starting to see the examples of that because to be honest, like in Montana where I live, the whole entire state hasn't even been surveyed for bees. We don't really know exactly how many we even have in Montana. And we don't know the life cycles of a lot of bees. Even with only 42 species of bumblebee in the US, there are certain species, in particular ones that are considered kleptoparasitic, that we don't even know what their host species are. So we've got so much to learn before we can even understand how the effects are impacting bees. We just know that they're not doing very well.
Okay, and final question for you today. A lot of people want to know the updated status on the Rusty Patch since 2015 when the film was made. Has it received protection?
Yes, so we were able to get the species listed under the Endangered Species Act, which was an amazing moment for us. And it was announced before Obama left office that it was going to be protected. When the new administration came in, it was put on hold, but eventually was pushed through for listing. But the challenge is, and one of the great things about trying to protect a bumblebee is that it's in people's hands more than an endangered species in some faraway place, because the bees are actually found in people's backyards. But one of the challenges is that it's hard to designate critical habitat, which is one of the things that has to come to play under the Endangered Species Act. And so, unfortunately, there had to be some lawsuits against the Fish and Wildlife Service to designate critical habitat for the rusty patch, because out of all the species that have been listed, this is a very unique situation. It's not found in one particular tributary of a river or one patch of wildlife, one patch of forest. It's found in places like, Chicago. And so it's hard to figure out exactly how that works, but things are moving forward with designating habitat. And the other good things that are happening as a result is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, for example, that was going to go through critical habitat in southern Appalachian, was put on hold or basically denied over 5 times because of the rusty patch and some other species that are found in the path of the pipeline. So good things are happening as a result of the listing, and also more people are becoming aware of the plight of other bumblebees because of the listing. So even though things are still in process, it's been a really positive step for bumblebee conservation.
Okay, well, that was absolutely fascinating, Clay. I'm so glad you were able to join us, and I'll hand it back over to you for some closing comments.
Sure, I really appreciate that. And what I would say to all of you listening is that the thing I love about protecting bees and bee conservation is that everyone who's listening can play a big part, because your backyard harbors thousands of invertebrates if you're not spraying pesticides and fungicides and you're planting flowers. Even if you're not, your backyard is a wildlife refuge, essentially, no matter if you have just a patio with some pots or if you've got a larger sized backyard. Your backyard harbors thousands and thousands of different species, many of those you can't see with the naked eye. And you imagine your community then becomes a huge wildlife preserve, right, for things like bees. And here in Bozeman, Montana, Livingston, Montana, where I live now, we have really rare bees in our backyard. I have a species called the Western Bumblebee, which is another rusty-patched, essentially. It's not doing well. Or the American Bumblebee, which is another species. It's got the name of the American Bumblebee, but it's not doing great. But what can help them tremendously is by taking the time to, again, plant those flowers in your yard and beautify your yard, mow your grass less, get rid of your lawn, and do some things like that will really help bees. Because if we all work together, we can actually make a tremendous difference for bees. They just need that food and that shelter, and they'll do great. So, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a real honor to speak with you all.
Yeah, my thanks as well. And be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll get that replay out to you soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thanks, Clay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.